from the News Channel 5 Network, this is Open Line.
Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Levi Ismail. We're here for Open Line, and with us here we have Dr. James Antoon. I got that right.
Yes.
Just making sure. Dr. James Antoon is a pediatrician and also a flu researcher. And so today we're talking about a word that I only found out about earlier this week, tripledemic.
Yes.
And so for those folks who may not be as acclimated with the term, if you wouldn't mind, kind of describe to us what that is.
Sure. Recently, you've probably heard in the news that a virus called respiratory syncytial virus, or RSV, has been surging early and been particularly severe this year. And RSV is a virus we typically see in young children and also in older adults. And with that, we have an early flu season that's been particularly severe. And then the third virus is COVID. COVID in Tennessee has been not terrible recently, but the unknown is COVID going to surge this year like it did last winter? And if we have three viruses that are circulating at the same time, that's very high and causing people to be sick, we would term that a tripledemic.
Gotcha. And so now that people are aware of the topic for the evening, you see our phone number right there, 615-737-7587. If you have any questions for Dr. Antoon, you know, in regards to the tripledemic. Now, you know, you mentioned this earlier when we were talking about the tripledemic and how rare it is to see three types of pandemics or three types of, you know, very concerning conditions out there at the same time. Now, tell us a little bit more about that.
So RSV typically has a predictable season in the winter that has about the same number of hospitalizations each year. The reason for that is because about every child 3 years old has been exposed to RSV and has some sort of natural immunity to it. And so year over year, we know what's coming with RSV for the most part. Flu is much harder to predict, and it's been very hazardous for physicians to try and predict a flu season because it can be terrible one year, not that bad the next year, and we just haven't had a third virus circulating that's caused a lot of problems. There's a number of other winter viruses that are not COVID, not flu, not RSV, but they typically aren't circulating at high levels and tend to be up and down with their severity. But these three viruses this year circulating all at the same time at high levels just hasn't happened before.
I see. And you know, one of the things that I thought was interesting, we're talking about RSV, and this is something that I think not a whole lot of people know much about it. Mm-hmm. You know, it might just go over your heads. And you said, you know, if you're a parent, then yes, you may know a little bit more because you've had children who may have been exposed and, you know, who are in the hospital or hospitalized because of it. But why do you think it is that RSV is just not as well known?
I think it's because it typically affects children less than 2 the most. Mm-hmm. We have the most hospitalizations in young children. It typically is worse in those who are less than 2 because it can go from a regular cold that's in the upper respiratory tract. It can go down into the lungs and cause inflammation or something called bronchiolitis. And when you have bronchiolitis, you can have difficulty breathing, respiratory distress, and require hospitalization and sometimes ICU care. And it can also cause secondary infections like a secondary pneumonia and get kids really, really sick. And I think the reason a lot of adults don't know about it is because it usually targets and affects young children the most. So I think parents oftentimes will know about it, but you know, older adults may not. We now know that RSV is an under-recognized cause of respiratory illness in the elderly and people over 65, and actually there are more hospitalizations for people over 65 now than there are in children less than 2. So there's over 100,000 hospitalizations for RSV in older adults and about 75,000 a year in young kids.
I see. And so, I mean, I guess it would make sense that there are the folks who are right in the middle of that age group who may not know a whole lot about it until it impacts them, whether they have children or they have parents who, you know, are experiencing it. And so that's, I will admit, I'm one of the folks who knew very little about RSV. You know, I'm not a parent. Mm-hmm. And I don't have parents who are in that age bracket quite yet.
It's also typically not in the news. What makes it newsworthy this year is that it's out of season, or it started very early in its season, and it came on so severe so quickly, it overwhelmed children's hospitals, which usually doesn't happen.
I see. And so one of the other things that we're talking about is obviously COVID. Mm-hmm. And, you know, I have in my notes here, you know, we were going to discuss some of the variants that are out there. You know, and I whenever I think of, you know, COVID variants, I'm thinking the absolute worst because we've seen the absolute worst. Tell us a little bit about what we're seeing now.
So these new BQ variants are starting to take over from the previous Omicron variants, the BA4, BA5, and more than half of the strains circulating now are these new variants. We don't know as much about these because they're so new, but early reports are they're potentially less severe than the previous variants, which is great, but they also evade the immune system a little bit more than the previous variant. So less severe, but maybe a little more infectious than previous variants.
I see. Okay. I know that I have a lot of friends who are, you know, coming down with COVID, and, you know, I wasn't quite sure if this was, you know, a contributing factor. You know, we always hear, like, someone says, oh, you know, it's catching on, and there's a lot of it going on around, you know, or there's a lot of COVID going on right now. I'm like, okay, well, is this a different variant? You know, I haven't heard anything about a different variant, and so chances are it's what we're seeing here. Okay. Yeah,
very likely. You know, odds are that if you're getting COVID now, it's going to be one of these new variants. The silver lining is our new bivalent vaccine, which contains the original strain of COVID and Omicron in it, seems to work well for these new circulating strains. There's a new study that came out recently that showed that it prevents symptomatic infection from the new variants, and we have data to show that it also prevents severe disease and hospitalization as well.
I see. Okay. Now, you know, some of these the different treatments that are out there right now, I think this is something that a lot of people, you know, would find interesting, is that there's so many different, whether it's a commercial on TV or, you know, friends talking amongst each other and saying, hey, have you tried this? And, you know, I feel like we're at a point where there might be the threat of misinformation out there concerning what you can actually do to protect yourself from this. And so what do you tell people when they ask you, okay, well, what if I try this, or is this something that I should consider?
First and foremost, the best way to protect yourself is prevention and getting the vaccine and boosting your immune system. So if you do get COVID, it's not going to be as severe as it otherwise would be. And doing all of those measures that work so great during the pandemic, like, you know, coughing and sneezing into your elbow, a lot of frequent hand washing, wearing a mask around people who are sick, that sort of thing. All those preventative measures work now just as well as they did back then. If you test positive for COVID and you have underlying conditions or comorbidities, or if you're over 65, there's a medication called Paxlovid that works extremely well for preventing hospitalization and severe disease with COVID if you take it early. And so if you have one of those conditions, definitely call your doctor and tell them that you have COVID, because you might be eligible to get this medication that is an antiviral that works really well for COVID.
Gotcha. Okay. I think we got a couple callers here. Let's go to hello?
Hello?
Is this Thomas?
Yeah.
Hi, Thomas.
How you doing?
We're doing just fine. You had a question?
Well, I've got a comment and a question.
Okay.
Look, I'm 75 years old. I've gotten all my COVID updates and my free flu shot. Now, have you ever heard our governor encourage people to get vaccinated? Because I never have. Have you?
That's a good question. I have not, so actually.
I would say I work at Vanderbilt University, that has some of the preeminent vaccine researchers in the country, and those who helped develop our COVID vaccines. And these experts have all emphasized how incredible it is that these vaccines were developed so quickly and so safely, and that these are very safe and effective vaccines, and that we just have a mountain of evidence of how well they work. So I commend you for getting all of your vaccines, and I hope other people do as well.
Thank you, Thomas.
Well, I encourage people to do it too. Thank you.
Yep. And then I believe we have, is this Jackie?
Yeah.
Hi, Jackie. You have a question for us?
Hi. Sir, yes, I do. I take vitamin D3 because I was told to keep my antibodies up. I have all kind of, I guess I'm in the risk, what you would call a risk factor, in the simple fact that I have COPD and other respiratory issues. So as long as I'm taking my vitamin 3D and K and the K2 KY or something I take, will that help prevent me from getting this other RSV stuff?
So there's been a lot of research around vitamin D and its effect on both preventing infections and severity of infections. And as far as I am aware, there's not been a great study to show that vitamin D is preventative for COVID. It certainly won't hurt. I don't know how much it would actually help, but I think if you're taking it, and vitamin D, is a good vitamin to take for other reasons as well, I would say keep taking it. I'm not sure how well it would prevent COVID in this case, but if you've been fully vaccinated, I think that's the best way, especially with this new bivalent booster, to protect yourself from COVID.
I think she also mentioned RSV as well.
Yeah, so I'm a pediatrician, and I treat young children, and in RSV and young kids, vitamin D has not been shown to either prevent RSV or lessen the infection once you have it.
And what about the adult?
I am not aware of the adult studies on it. I'll be honest with you. So I would say talk to your doctor who treats people over 65, and they may have a different answer for you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. All right. So obviously a lot of questions there about, what we can do to prevent some of this stuff from, getting any worse or catching it in the first place. And I think, when she mentioned, what can we do? I have vitamin D and I have something else that I can take or something like that. Just based on the conversation we've already had, you go back to the vaccine. Okay. And so I guess that's one thing that I don't know if it's lost on people, just the idea that it really starts with one thing and then you can add on to it after that.
Yeah, so we have 3 circulating viruses, RSV, flu, and COVID, and we have vaccines for 2 of them, for flu and for COVID. And this year our flu vaccine is a really good match for the circulating strain of flu. And we know that if you have more than one virus at the same time, so if you have RSV and flu, or RSV and COVID, or RSV and any other winter virus, that you're more likely to have severe disease, and you're more likely, if you're hospitalized, to need ICU care. And you can get really, really sick if you have one virus, and then, obviously you can get even sicker if you have 2. So the best way to protect yourself from getting multiple viruses at the same time is to get vaccinated for viruses that we know that there's a vaccine for and that work, and that's flu and COVID. Unfortunately, there's no FDA-approved vaccine for RSV. There's some promising candidates out there, but we've been working really hard for decades to get an RSV vaccine, and it's eluded us so far.
Dr. Antoon, we'll be right back. And of course, our phone number is right there, 615-737-7587. You guys can give us a call back as soon as we come back from commercial break.